throw it over to Ian, and he can tell you more about what he's got going on, and we'll dive right into the presentation.
I do have a JetBrains winner, so thank y'all for your interest, and we can try again next month.
I'm going to steal your screen sharing, Logan.
Yep.
All righty. So I am Ian Littman, and we are going to talk about PHP 8.2 today. I admin to some extent phpc.social, kind of help run this meetup, and when I'm not doing either of those things, I'm doing a whole bunch of code reviews, and then a whole bunch of specking, and then occasionally actually writing code at a little startup called Covie, which means that I get to decide when we go to PHP 8.2, and the answer to that is actually later on this evening, because I apparently like living dangerously. Now you might be wondering, well, why would he do that? It's like, well, PHP 8.2 is, it's a point release, and like there are some nice quality of life improvements there, and the deprecations that PHP 8.2 has in it, we aren't really hit by. Basically our PR to go from PHP 8.1 to 8.2 compatibility was forward and backward compatible. So we merged that PR back multiple weeks ago, updated libraries, like Psalm, I think, was the big one that we needed to update for 8.2 compatibility. And there were literally 5 lines of code in our code base, which is tens of thousands of lines at this point, that we needed to change. And it was all string interpolation stuff to go from deprecation free 8.1 to deprecation free 8.2. So as long as you're not doing dynamic properties, it's not a scary upgrade. Now, of course, why would you even bother? Well, we'll get into that in a second. Before I continue here, if you want to follow along, the information in these slides, which there's a whole bunch of links in these slides, is available at the URL ian.im/php8.2merge. So first off, thanks so much to our release managers for this year. That would be Ben Ramsey, Pierre Charon, and Sergey Pantelev, who helped us get PHP 8.2 across the line. That happened earlier today. Things were tagged a day or two earlier and announced today. And well, they're already on various places that you can download them, including a tap for Brew. So I think this is the quickest a presentation has been out for a release version of PHP so far. Last year, there was like a week between 8.1 release and the MergePHP presentation on that. So kind of fun seeing things hit so quickly. So we'll take a look at how to get PHP 8.2, what's new, what's deprecated and removed, and where to find out more information. I pulled a lot of this stuff from Stitcher.io and PHP Watch, as well as the official PHP 8.2 landing page. There is additional information in the PHP 8.2 changelog, but that is a little bit too in the weeds, so we won't be covering that in the presentation. I feel free though to dig in there and see what all bugs were fixed and that sort of thing, because this 8.2, kind of like say 7.3, was a big quality of life release, less big on huge headline features, with the dynamic properties deprecation aside. So if you want to get 8.2 now, if you're on Mac OS, I don't think you can get it via the standard brew tap quite yet, but if you tap the one that's shown up on your screen right now and install PHP at 8.2 there, it will work. I actually did that earlier today and it did install just fine. I was able to confirm that it worked because things like disjunctive normal form types started working. So you can get it there if you're on Mac OS. If you're on Ubuntu or Debian, as per usual, Andrej is where you would pull that. Instructions are linked there. If you're on some Red Hat or CentOS variant, as usual, go hit up Remy's repo. It's released there. Docker tagged releases on Docker Hub a couple hours ago now. And that includes a version that runs on top of Alpine. On Covie's side, we use Alpine for all of our containers. So is a welcome addition there. So we're now going to be running PHP 8.2 on Alpine 3.17. If you're on Windows, you can download Windows builds. If you want to compile things for some reason, then you can compile them. Again, take a look at that short link that I mentioned earlier, and all of these items are linked except the brew tap bits, which again, grab homebrew and go from there. So starting off, we'll talk about new features. If you started using read-only properties in 8.1, well, you might have found that you were creating a whole bunch of classes with all read-only properties. And that got kind of annoying because it's read-only, 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 read-only. Well, now you can pull that to the top of your class with read-only classes. And when you do that, it does a few things. First off, you can no longer add properties to your class dynamically. Even if you use the annotation to opt back into that behavior, it won't work. You won't be able to declare properties on your class without specifying what type they are. Mixed is a type if you really want to. And you won't be able to set properties after they've been set the first time. So I think in our code base, we will start using this relatively extensively because for large swaths of what we do, classes are, at least with respect to themselves, immutable after they're created. So we can stick read-only at the top of the class, make sure that things are actually immutable. Well, with respect to itself, you're talking about objects here, so things may change under the hood unless you're dealing with just a whole bunch of like integer or float string properties. But you throw read-only at the top and you can get rid of read-only in your individual property declarations, whether those are declared like you see here, or whether they're declared in the constructor property promotion. So read-only classes is kind of one of the big headline quality of life improvements that we see with PHP 8.2. It sounds like we'll get some additional improvements in PHP 8.3 that allow for more flexibility on read-only classes. Next thing is better handling of types. So in 8.0, we got union types. In 8.1, we got intersection types. Well, now you can combine them with notation called disjunctive normal form. And what that allows you to do is, as shown here, you can say, hey, I need a class that conforms to both of these interfaces, or is this concrete implementation over here? And that allows you a lot of flexibility to, say, specify something that you can't necessarily modify the interface on because it's in some library or something. Or maybe it's a core PHP thing. And you can actually build out saying, hey, this core interface or this core implementation, like let that go through. And also it has to be some instance of something else, or it could be something completely different. and you can build that up using the type system and actually have the runtime verify that things are working rather than leaning on static analysis and doc blocks. There are some limitations on this in terms of it's rather strict about how you specify these types. If you are doing A and B or C, you got to wrap things in parentheses. And if you read through the RFC, you can see a little bit more detail on exactly what you can and cannot do. But I've highlighted a few other rules here on this slide. So that's disjunctive normal form types. Next up is we have a couple more standalone types, which mesh well with union types, intersection types, and, well, union types primarily in disjunctive normal form. So now you can, just like people have been doc blocking forever, that there's a result is either a like PDO statement or false. You can now enforce that in the type system and say, look, this is never going to return true, so let's explicitly say it's this or false rather than this or Boolean, and then not be able to get quite that same level of rigor. Make sure that Discord is closed because it does not know how to obey do not disturb. So that allows you to specify explicitly null as a type or false as a type or true as a type. And that's just kind of a completeness thing around the type system, so that you're not having to fall back to doc blocks and static analysis that's done by something other than the runtime to describe how your either parameters or returns are on functions, or for that matter, property names or properties. So one really cool thing that we're getting in 8.2 is this random extension. And what that does is, for really the first time in core, gives you an object-oriented randomizer that, whether you want something kind of low-powered and quick, or something high-powered and cryptographically secure, you can use the same interface, and it's pretty well thought out. It allows you to do things like shuffling array items around, picking items from an array, grabbing an integer between a minimum or a max, or just an integer in general. There are a number of things that the randomizer will build out for you on top of what we call a random engine. Now, the interface for this engine is super simple, which means that it's easy to mock, and then the randomizer itself does all the heavy lifting to turn that into strings or picking stuff from arrays or what have you. So the cool thing about this is it makes it a lot easier to kind of seed and mock random data in tests or something to that effect. And then once you get into a production environment, you swap out for something that is truly pseudo-random or cryptographically pseudo-random, and you're off to the races. And one of the things that, like, this is secure by default. If you ask for a randomizer and don't specify an engine as its constructor parameter, then by default, it'll give you a secure one. So basically trying to avoid as many footguns as possible when building out randomization for whether that's session IDs or playing slide deck karaoke or what have you. And these randomizers that are built into the random extension, which as part of 8.2, random end and random bytes have been pulled into the random extension and out of the main core. Shouldn't matter to much of anybody here, but these particular randomness engines The non-cryptographically secure ones can be seeded in the constructor. So it's a nice kind of object-oriented approach to getting things that either are actually random or pseudo-random, or at least look that way. You know, like Mercy and Twister or stuff like that is just a sequence generator, but it looks random enough on the surface for certain use cases, and it's a lot faster than reading from W random or RC4 random or what have you. One thing that I've been basically wanting since traits have existed in 5.4 is constants and traits, and now years and years later we have them. So there are some limitations around this. You can't declare, unlike an interface where you can declare an interface and then declare constants on that and then just use the constants directly. In this case, if you declare constants on a trait, you have to import that trait and then call those constants kind of within the context of that class that you imported, which is, it's similar to how you can't just call a random method on a trait without importing it into a class. So it's consistent, it's compiler assisted copy and paste. Now, if you want to, you can redeclare those same constants in whatever you're importing into. But you have to have the exact same visibility, exact same value, and exact same final or lack thereof in order to do that. Now, constants can be redefined in child classes as long as they're not final. So you can kind of play around the edges with that if you really want to. But if you're importing a set of constants via a trait into a class, then what you import is what you get. So another nice security thing in addition to the better randomness is, or better interface to randomness rather, is this sensitive parameter value redaction. So if you're dealing with secrets in method names or anything to that effect, or method calls rather, so say database connection strings or API keys or something like that, you can now at the engine level, without having to do anything fancy like the Paragon IE hidden string class, say with an annotation, hey, mark this particular thing as a sensitive parameter, and then that parameter won't be leaked in backtraces, whether that's an exception or whether you just do debug print backtrace or debug backtrace. So it wraps those values in an object that, again, allows you to not leak your secrets all over the place. So there are a number of these things where, like this one is, there are implementations like Paragon IE hidden string that do something really similar to this without requiring 8.2 and without requiring the annotation. But this annotation works with any old string and is supplied and applied at a method call. So it's a fair bit less work for a rather similar outcome, which is, again, not leaking your stuff into your logs. So kind of more minor thing is enumerations. You like using them, you want to use them everywhere, and then you can't because you can't, for example, use them in constant expressions. Well, the 8.2 fixes that. So now you can say, hey, I want name or I want value or whatever. Since enumeration properties are set from the get-go, it's like, okay, well, we can just resolve these things at compile time. We don't have to wall you off and say you can't access the value in a constant expression. So it's just kind of cleaning up a use case where if you want to use enumerations heavily, this allows you to avoid needing to provide strings in some of these places instead of enumerations. So in Covie, in Covie's code base, we have pretty heavily used enums since we switched to 8.1, and this ability will clean up our code a bit in a number of places, because we don't have to switch over to strings. We can just stay in enumeration land until the last possible second. So with that, those are really the big features of PHP 8.2. There are a whole bunch of smaller tweaks, like date time, immutable create from mutable, date time, mutable create from immutable now returns static rather than, or the signature is static rather than a date time, immutable, or date time, which gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of extending those methods and actually having that type safety, and saying, yeah, this carbon immutable thing is going to return another carbon immutable, and not having to override anything to do that. Technically a BC break, but like it's definitely an improvement there in terms of not having to rewrite things. PCRE does have that no auto capture modifier. I will defer to somebody who is better at regular expressions on what exactly that will do for you. Any parse quantity, if you're, say, specifying memory limits or something to that effect, and using, which those memory limits are not actually in, you don't specify 256 MB, you specify 256 M because that's just a unit. So 256 M is 256 times 1024 times 1024. Well, now you have a method that will go from that 256 M and tell you exactly how many bytes are in there, which is, you know, kind of handy. And there are some changes on the BC side that I'll get into later that that come along with that. There's also this curl upkeep method that basically makes sure that a connection is kept alive, so that, you know, you're not dropping it and having to reconnect. That's primarily like your HTTP keep alive packets and such. Also on curl, if you post to a form and then it redirects and then curl gets the resulting page, you can now look at curl get info and then curl opt effective method to figure out the HTTP verb that you ended up on once you got through the redirects. Actually, earlier today, somebody was asking about profiling memory usage on something. It's like, yeah, you can do that one of two ways, one of which is memory get peak usage. Well, if you want to reset that because, say, you have a long-running script and you need a little more granularity in profiling, or you have a script that uses a whole lot of memory to start up and then drops down to a reasonable amount, and you don't want to not catch, say, memory leaks over time once startup has happened, you can use memory reset peak usage to kind of reset that counter and then start from there. If you're using the MySQLi extension, you can now prepare, bind, and run a query in a single statement, rather than having to split that over 3 different statements. And that's this execute query method. This is available in both procedural and object-oriented versions of MySQLi. So it makes things a lot less painful relative to the thing that you take for granted in PDO. Error log mode in the any file actually controls permissions on that error log file if PHP creates it. If the file already exists and it's just writing to it, it's not going to modify those permissions. OpenSSL cipher key length. Given an algorithm, it'll tell you say AES 256, if you put that in there, then it'll tell you, hey, the key length for this is 32 bytes. So that way you're not having to throw a whole bunch of constants around or have some array mapping of constants to for algorithms to their proper key length. So a fair number of little quality of life improvements around cryptography and security in this release. There are a few new zip archive methods, a few new reflection methods, and a few random methods in the kind of junk drawer toward the end there that are added in PHP 8.2. All of these are linked in the presentation in case any of these strike your interest. So with that, like that's all that's new in PHP 8.2. It's not a super heavy release in terms of new features. The ones that are there are pretty useful, but you know, it's not kind of the massive change that say 8.0, 8.1, or even 7.4 was, or 7.1 if you go far enough back. And honestly, the backward compatibility breaks, in terms of sheer quantity of them, there's not a ton. In terms of actual impact, you may get hit with some of these depending on how old your code base is and how it's written, and we'll go into these from basically most controversial on down. So of course, we're going to talk about dynamic property deprecation. This was a hot button issue because you have, well, it's a nice, dynamic properties are a nice way to do quick and dirty PHP code. And while it makes things a little bit harder to get right, yeah, you could work around that, potentially typoing things by effectively disallowing dynamic properties via static analysis. The debate back and forth on this happened about this time last year, and this particular one, yes, you can throw an attribute at the top of every class and extend from those classes to opt back into dynamic properties without having a deprecation warning, which, like, unless something changes, dynamic properties without this attribute will go away in PHP 9. We'll see where things end up. My guess is that there's going to be some back and forth that people don't actually bump up to PHP 8.2 as a result of this particular deprecation. Again, it's all fixable, but it hits a lot of code where you're just trying to get something out. You're willing to put up with potential issues around typos or that sort of thing. And so particularly because this has a an attribute that, like, you get down below PHP 8 and no attributes to speak of, it's kind of tricky to get this implemented in code bases that are older. But again, this doesn't wall off dynamic properties entirely. Even for classes that have them with no changes, you're just going to get deprecation warnings right now. And if you're using magic setters and getters, you're good. If you're using standard class, you're good. If you throw the attribute at the top of the class, you're good. If you don't use dynamic properties, you're good. But again, this is a like the most controversial by far deprecation that I can think of off the top of my head in probably the past 5 years. Next up, if you're using UTF-8 encode and decode, like, they're probably not doing what you expect them to, and they are now deprecated. It's like, if you want to play around with encodings, use some function that is better named and more flexible. One kind of interesting change here is strtolower, upper, UC first, LC first, that whole family of functions. You can go to this link to see more info on that. All of those now ignore locale. They don't try to do anything special with locale detection, internationalization, any of that. They now just operate on ASCII characters. If you want to uppercase or lowercase based on internationalized strings, then either use your multi-byte methods or something like the INTL or iconv extensions instead. In another kind of cleanup item, if you are using MB string encoding methods to deal with base64, UU encoding, or qprint or HTML entities, use a more purpose-built method instead, because those particular items are also being deprecated because they're not really character encodings anyway. Next, and so this top item is literally the only change that we had to make in the Covie code base. It was 5 lines of changes, and they were all this one thing, and that is string interpolation syntax. It was a quick change. It was just a matter of like this. There are like 4 different string interpolation syntaxes in PHP, and this particular one is being cleaned up and deprecated. So that's really all we had to do in our particular code base. Of course, ours is one that we got it down to 0 notice code in PHP 8.1. So it may not be a fair comparison, but literally that was the only change that we needed to make around a string interpolation. There's one thing that I have used in previous projects, so this might have bitten me in those, is some of these callable syntaxes where you're using string names or arrays to indicate what function should be called. Those are being cleaned up this time so that we can get on a path where you can actually use callable as a proper type in more places than it is right now. Like right now, yes, you can use it as a parameter for a function or method, but you can't use it as a property type. You can't use it as a return type, because what callable means kind of varies depending on whether you're just using the parentheses syntax for calling something or whether you are using call user func. So this kind of paves the way for that. If you're doing kind of that metaprogramming stuff, just be aware that that is going to be throwing you deprecation warnings. Also, if you run across this SPL file info bit, like I believe that's either deprecated or gone. Some other changes here: SPL file info and object signature changes are basically enforcing the signatures that they said they had in the first place. Technically, that's a backward compatibility break. ODBC now escapes usernames and passwords, whether that is direct or via PDO. MySQLi, if you were trying to compile it with the older, crappier libmysqli, you can't do that anymore. MySQLND is what you should be using anyway. PDO can still be compiled with libmysql, but again, MySQLND is better for that. Any parsing, so this is the thing that I mentioned on that any get quantity bit. Now, if you hand an invalid invalid integer value into something that needs to be an integer, or something K or something M or something G, for example, like memory limits or something like that, then the runtime will now yell at you and say, hey, fix your incorrect integer there. You have all the tools you need to do it. If you were using K-sort and expecting it to continue giving you letters first than numbers, then the behavior is swapped here to be consistent with every other sort function. And lastly, and this is something that I'm pretty darn happy about, stir split. If you split an empty string in PHP 8.1 or earlier, then you get an array with a single value with an empty string, and it's really annoying. This fixes that. As far as I'm concerned, it's a bug fix. Yes, it's a backward compatibility break, but now if you stir split on an empty string, it gives you an empty array and life is better. So with that, again, 8.2, other than that big old controversial thing, and read-only classes, and a few other things, which are great quality of life improvements, by the way. That's PHP 8.2. I think there's some performance improvements under the hood and the like, as we've seen with basically every single PHP release coming through. But it is a lot less of a big deal. Like, assuming you're not using dynamic properties, it's a lot less of a big deal upgrade wise than 8.1 was by a long shot. Like, of the upgrades that I've dealt with recently, 7.4 to 8.0, 8.0 8.1, and 8.1 to 8.2, 8.2 I believe had the least changes required, and libraries have, because there are fewer changes required, libraries have largely caught up. So as mentioned, I think we'll be rolling 8.2 out imminently for Covie. And yeah, it's been great to see the, with a little bit of a delay, is like, okay, let's make sure that this thing is fully baked. There was a release candidate 7 for here. So for a short period of time, there were only 2 actively maintained, including security fixes, PHP releases. Well, now we're back to 3. And I'm looking forward to using the quality of life improvements in 8.2 on various projects that I'm working on. So there are, these are the places that I pulled basically all of this information from for this presentation. PHP Watch, Stitcher, and the actual release page on php.net. You can go in and look at the changelog as well. That really gets into the weeds. There are a lot of bug fixes in there. Yeah, go forth and have fun with a new release. With that, I am Ian Littman. This talk is available at ian.im/php82merge, so you can actually click all of the gazillion links that I put in here. I am ENSLTX on GitHub, ENSLTX on Twitter, and on Mastodon and elsewhere in the Fediverse. I am Ian at phpc.social. With that, I'm going to hop into the chat and take questions. And if the presenters want to, or the other panelists want to throw questions at me, then feel free as well. Actually, I'll put that, I'll put the screen view back up here. 1 second. Just in case people need that link. There we go. Okay. So I'll hop over here and see what questions we have.
I didn't see too many. I think you answered all my questions. Thanks, Ben. Oh yeah, Buster has a question. Do you see it, Ian?
So the
Can you read out the question, please?
so let me confirm that
There's something else I can help.
Is it Buster's question about the read-only performance improvement bit? Is that
Yeah.
I'm honestly not sure. And I don't want to say one way or the other. Because I haven't talked to the person who implemented the read-only bits.
Stefano asks, are there any tools to help updating PHP versions? Not necessarily specific to 8.2. If you want to talk about that.
So yeah, as Lucas mentioned in chat, there is Rector, and that will go through your code and kind of bring it up to like, hey, if you can do constructor promoted properties, then it will move things into there and make a lot of those, like where Psalm or PHP CS or PHP Stan or Fan would tell you that, hey, you've got issues, or the PHP compatibility sniff on Code Sniffer. Rector will actually go through and make modifications to your code to catch things up with kind of a more modern style of things. From my understanding, while I haven't run Rector on our code base, it is rather opinionated and it will make a lot of changes. So be prepared for a pretty large diff once it runs on your code base. And to Ben's point, read-only classes are not immutable classes. It just means that you cannot go in and after a property has been assigned, reassign it to something else. So you can initialize a class, not initialize any of the properties, and then go back and add those properties in later. In answer to Lucas's question about DNF types, if you have control over your code such that you can add interfaces on everything that you possibly need to, and it's all well and good, then that's fine. And you may need DNF less, but if you're dealing with third-party code or something like that, where you can't necessarily change the signatures of the classes that you have to pass into your methods, or what you need to return, or something like that, having flexibility in the type system rather than having to kind of bail out and go back to static analysis and then returning mix at the runtime level is just something more powerful that you can enforce at the runtime. So I am looking through. I'm going to take a quick look through the entire chat log to see if I can pick up any other questions. It didn't look like there was anything else.
The one downside of this format is we can't bring everybody up on the stage And
Oh, I guess they just have to, go to some random Discord channel or something. I don't know.
yeah. Yeah.
There's one more question in YouTube here. Does PHP follow SymVersion, semantic versioning? Also, is there an LTS version?
The answers to that are no and no. PHP at the community level, there is a release. It happens, and then you get 2 years of bug fixes, 1 year of security only, and then that version is end of life. The last time that wasn't the case was PHP 5.6 that got an extra year and a little bit of change to allow people to migrate off of it. If you want to stay on an end of life version of the runtime and still get security fixes, either find a Linux distribution that will backport those, like CentOS had PHP 5.3.3 in their distro forever and kept backporting security fixes to it. So Linux distributions can totally backport security fixes to get you a little bit more longer term support for older versions. The other place that you would find longer term support for bug fixes for older versions would be Zend.
I think it is also important to note that, like, we don't call it LTS, but it kind of is LTS. Like, the node LTS is the same length as PHP versions. So
I mean,
yeah.
it's like there's been feedback that due to how quickly deprecations are happening, that 3 years from a PHP release happening to no longer even getting security fixes directly from the community is too short of a period. Maybe it should be longer. There is an active discussion back and forth, but again, the 3 years is a bare minimum, given that folks like the Linux distributions can provide those patches for longer. You just may not necessarily get those patches on top of the exact same release. Like, for example, Ubuntu, I think they
Like, do you
had
know,
like 5.5.8 and then would stack security patches on top of that.
I didn't look it up, but like, does anybody know how long the Ubuntu LTS is?
I think Ubuntu LTS is
Like six years, maybe?
I
I'm
want to say
guessing.
either 5 or 10.
Oh, wow.
I think there are certain releases that
I just looked it up. Ubuntu is 10.
Okay.
Wow.
So it's like, if you want to have security fixes for your PHP forever, then pick a version that Ubuntu has in an LTS release, which would be like the most recent one would be 2204, and then you're good for a while.
Does Perforce still offer their PHP patching service?
PHP patching as in LTS versions of whatever runtimes?
Yeah, you pay them and they'll continue applying patches to whatever version that you pay for.
Yes, they do. In fact, when they were at Longhorn this year, that was kind of a big thing that they were advertising. Is like, hey, are you ready for this EOL? If you are not, then pay us and we'll give you patched versions.
I just looked up Zen.com offers LTS versions of PHP as well.
Yep, that's the Perforce thing that Tim was mentioning.
Oh, well, I learned something new today.
I don't know what to call them anymore after the buyout.
They keep using, like, they have gone back to using Zend branding on everything. Like there's a little subtext by Perforce, but unlike Rogue Wave, they actually realized that the Zend brand actually means something. So they use that in all of their materials.
Josh just said he's glad his elephants aren't out of date anymore.
To answer Kevin's question on async, actually Ben has answered that on the fiber side of things, as well as React, AMP, and Swool. So there are ways to do stuff in PHP that are async. It's just you're not going to see that dropping into major libraries that are not named Guzzle. Although the interesting thing is, like with the application server side of things, like Laravel Octane and such, that's getting a little bit more common, although that's not like, it's not proper async stuff. It's just more of an application server sort of thing. All right, so I guess we have come to the end of questions. Thanks to everybody for your attention and for the questions. And Logan, you want to close this out?
Yeah. Yep. Thank you, Ian, for the presentation. I definitely learned a lot about PHP 8.2. I wonder if it goes to the where does everybody want to turn on their video and wave goodbye? There, you get your organizers. All right. Thanks for joining us, everyone. So next month, January 12th, I believe. So we'll get the announcements sent out here soon. But thank you all for joining us. Hope you have good holidays. And we'll see you next year.
Thanks so much, Ian, and thanks everybody else for coming.
Yep.
Great
There you
talk.
go.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye.
Here's y'all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.